Before we get into this episode, I just wanted to apologize for the audio quality. In addition to being in the car, as you'll hear me explain further in a minute, looks like my input device has reached the end of its life, but I didn't realize that until after the recording. So I'm going to make do with what I have, but I'm definitely going to get a new device as soon as possible. So apologies again. Thank you for listening. Let's get into it. Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. If you've listened to any of my recent episodes, you've heard me talk about the fact that I am taking the time where I can get it to do these kinds of production things, and these days it seems like some of that time exists while I'm driving. So I know that it is noisy and there's a lot of background noise, but hopefully my voice is clear enough that this will be worth doing. But either way, this is going to be a short one because I don't have a ton to say. I mean, I do have a ton to say about Homeland, which I just got through all 8 seasons, right? 8 seasons of with my wife. It was a show she watched probably around the time that it started. I think back in like maybe 2011-ish. And let me preface this right off the bat. Since I'm recording this while in the car, I don't have IMDb open in front of me. I don't have my notes. I'm just winging it. So if I forget or mispronounce character name or place or say the wrong season or the wrong date, forgive me. I'm just doing what I can do with the time that I have to do it. So a few months ago, we were scrolling through Hulu and my wife was like, "Oh, Homeland, have you ever seen that?" And I was like, no, I don't think I even ever heard of it. But our daughter had recently had to read Romeo and Juliet in school, which prompted us to want to show her the Baz Luhrmann version from the late 90s with Claire Danes and Leo DiCaprio in it. And then we watched another show on Hulu soon after that called, I think, like Fleischman's in Trouble or something like that with Jesse Eisenberg and Claire Danes, which I never felt compelled to release any official thoughts on this platform just because I didn't really have a huge reaction to it. It was entertaining while I watched it, but I didn't find it to be super memorable, except for the performance by Claire Danes, which was amazing, and that was a good primer for then watching Homeland because we were, on Hulu having watched that, and maybe it came up in recommendations or something, more Claire Danes related stuff. And I realized that I don't think I've seen Claire Danes in anything new since like T3, maybe. That was Claire Danes, right? Yeah. But I always really liked her as an actress, and I heard that she kept making stuff, so I was like, yeah, let's watch Homeland. I've never been too big into spy thrillers and espionage stuff. I mean, I love the Jason Bourne movies, though I haven't revisited them in years. Mission Impossible, I say, is not as spy-y as it's become action, which is fine. But I don't know, that's just never a genre that I've been super drawn to. So I wasn't sure how I was going to react to this show, but my wife introduced me to things like Gilmore Girls and revisited X-Files with me and things like that. So she has impeccable taste, and I was willing to take her word for it. But then seeing Mandy Patinkin too, that was a big draw, even though I didn't realize he was in it when we first started watching it. And the last thing I saw him in was Dead Like Me back in the early 2000s, which was kind of a mess of a show, but at its best it was great. And one of the reasons for that was him. And of course, I mean, Inigo Montoya was one of the best characters ever. So I was really excited to see him do something more current. And just right up front, I was gripped from the first episode. It was so compelling and so nuanced. The characters were so well characterized, three-dimensional, flawed, interesting, all the things that make it a compelling character study. And throughout the show, I was just so floored with the writing. So that's really what I want to focus on with this, like I usually do. If you've ever heard any of my podcasts before, I don't really like to do straight up just reviews. I don't do spoiler or non-spoiler things. I mean, I do spoilers, I guess, because I talk about the thing. I don't like playing that whole spoiler game. It's like if you haven't seen a thing and you're listening to this because you're deciding whether or not you should see it, I would go listen to a regular review first, and then this is more of a discussion and a dissection of what worked and didn't work and just my general thoughts and reactions. And that was my first big one, was the interplay between plot and character. I think maybe one reason that I've never been super drawn to spy stuff is that it tends to be very plot, even if not driven, focused. Because a lot of the Jason Bourne stuff, for instance, that's the closest thing I can compare right now off the top of my head, I guess. Did have a lot of really good character stuff going on, but a lot of it was more subtle and in the background almost to the driving plot that was a catalyst and the driving force between the forward momentum of those stories. And Homeland had, big global plots, even though a lot of times the plots were also very small and intimate. I found really interesting when it came to such large-scale stakes that were at stake with most of these seasonal arcs. But throughout all of that really heavy, intricate, sometimes a little convoluted, but not really. I thought the plot flow and development was usually very followable and followed up on really well, where even if you got a little lost episode to episode, it would bring things back around and wrap things up nicely or explain things. I never felt totally thrown off and unengaged. Disengaged? One of those words is right. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Anyway, throughout it all, the characters stayed strong and evolving. It was incredible to me how there was no status quo to return to. And that's a big thing about television that I often find unengaging or disengaging about seasonal serialized television shows a lot of times is even when there's big denouements plot developments that affect the characters and a season will end on either a huge cliffhanger or some kind of really status quo affecting denouement, the resolution, there is still a return to some kind of status quo, a comfort zone, if you will, for the characters, but also for the audience when it starts the next season. For instance, right now I'm in the middle of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which at my brother's constant pestering for years to watch this, I will do a whole episode on Buffy when we get through it, don't worry. But for now, my only real gripe with the show is that it does have a bit of, not always, but a bit of a status quo return to. Even Lost would do it, where they'd have some big upset with the others or something, and then the next season starts and the survivors are just back on the beach, like surviving and doing their thing, and you're like, really? Stuff like that. Homeland kind of did that, but they would do it in ways that evolve the characters, and it was really smart that the characters would often end up in a new location. So at the very least, like one season would end in, I don't know, DC, and the next one would start in Berlin. So there was always that feeling of evolution and change and unpredictability for the plot and the characters. Because you're like, this is all new to me, this is new to them, like what's going to happen next? As opposed to with a lot of these more status quo kind of plot arcs that we see a lot of time in serialized television, you're like, oh, here's our characters back to where they started, more or less. I wonder what new plot element is going to take them out of that status quo. It's a bit of a fine line difference, but I did find that to be very compelling going through all the seasons of the show. But no matter how big, far-reaching, how high the stakes were when it came to the plot, it always felt like a character-driven show, because the characters were rarely just reacting to the plot. The plot was happening, the story was unfolding because of the characters' choices. Plot was most often consequence of the characters, and I think that's what really kept me gripped for so many seasons. I never felt like there was a lull, or there was like, that one season wasn't as good as other ones. They definitely were different, and I liked how the seasons had sort of a unique quality to each one, not just by virtue of location or what the plot was, but that all the seasons were, to some degree, self-contained stories that to some degree resolved themselves, at least the big picture stuff, within the confines of the season. But every season, for the most part, was a consequence, if not a continuation of the last season too, but something you don't see all that much. I mean, all I can think of right now is like Deep Space Nine or Babylon 5, where there were like multi-season arcs where each season was its own story, but it also was part of a bigger story. So I'm thinking of the Brody arc in the first 3-ish seasons, but they weren't always back to back. And this also speaks to how well the writing had to have been planned out beforehand, because very rarely did any characters or plot development feel sort of arbitrary and just like a device to keep things going. So for instance, and again, I'm not in front of my computer, so I can't look it up right now, but the Taliban leader character, who was absolutely monstrous in the season that he was first featured in, which I want to say was maybe like 4 or 5, somewhere in there. And then we didn't see him for a couple seasons, and then he reemerges with a similar motivations, but he has developed over that time too. He's evolved, and he's now looking to negotiate peace. Those seasons are directly intertwined, but they are their own contained thing. That takes a lot of pre-planning and groundwork that you don't always see in serialized television, especially because a lot of times they just don't know how long a show is going to go for. It depends on its popularity. So they have to wrap things up more or less, or if they don't, there's that danger that it's going to be left on a indefinite cliffhanger. Like the OA, for instance, which still frustrates me to this day because I spent the time and energy to get invested in that show, and those characters canceled. So that really kept me gripped and intrigued and kept things feeling fresh and relevant and not like repetitive or unnecessary. You know, where a lot of shows, you're kind of spin their wheels and you're like, you know, we've kind of seen these plot lines before, we've seen these character beats already. The writing of the show really did feel like they had a long-term plan, and if they didn't, they were really smart to set it up in such a way that it could grow and evolve. And I think a lot of that just comes with the strength of the characters, how well they were written individually, but also how well developed their relationships were. But the multi-season arc thing leads me to another point that I wanted to make about the writing of the show, was how amazing of a feat the writers did to take characters who all existed in gray areas. Nobody was, even if they were initially presented as evil or righteous, everybody had skeletons in their closet, everybody had flaws, everybody was fallible to have the audience question their integrity or have themselves question their own integrity. And I really liked that. I really enjoyed how they managed to keep it on this level where nobody was all the way good or bad. And even when somebody was presented as a monster, like the Taliban leader character or the Iranian intelligence officer that became an asset of Saul's, or even President, it was Keen, right? That had some really rough, dark, and uncomfortable character choices that led her places that I didn't think we were going to be able to come back from in terms of being sympathetic or empathetic towards her as a character. But somehow they managed to take these characters. It wasn't full empathy that we felt for them. They were definitely relatable. You could understand where people were coming from, why they were doing what they were doing, where their motivations came from, and how easily it would be for somebody even like Carrie or Saul to become like their Afghani or Iranian or Russian counterpart, for instance. And that's why that last season was particularly so compelling, because they finally put Carrie in a place where there was a shadow of a doubt of what her intentions and integrity and motivations really were. We thought we knew her, but then there was all this lost time, not just for the character, but also for the audience, which I found interesting that we never really got a lot of insight about, which made the ending all that much more ambiguous and frustratingly satisfying, which fits this genre perfectly. Because if everything was laid out, I really thought for a moment at the end that she had defected for sure, and it felt so cheap and rushed for her to just become a love interest of her Russian counterpart guy. But then the way that they, like the last couple minutes, gave so much more layers and nuance to the whole thing. I just thought it was like one of the most perfect endings to a show, because perfectly resolved everything that the show started with, and yet left me wanting more. And I think that's what a good ending should do, be unforgettable. But yeah, the whole gray area thing is something that's really hard to balance, because there are so many stories that beat you over the head with that message that, you know, nobody's good or bad. Both sides are, you know, but it can just be really pandering and simplistic in execution a lot of times. But in Homeland, it really felt earned, and there was a good balance. And again, I was just amazed that we were able to stick around with characters who had done unforgivably abhorrent things, especially a lot of our antagonists in the show, but also Carrie and Saul, that some of the decisions that they made, the hard calls they had to make. There was always that gray area of what if they didn't, they still made a decision, like when Carrie bombed that wedding reception, came back to haunt her more than once. It was amazing to me how we were able to come back around on these characters and still have more story to tell. I don't know if redeemed is the right word, because some of the stuff that these characters did was, to me, objectively irredeemable, but I was still willing to go with them on the story, and I found it crazy, like when I started trusting the storyline of the Taliban leader and everything he did to prove that after everything that he did in the war that he fought, that he really wanted to find some kind of mutual peace with America. And I couldn't believe, like, after everything that happened at the episode where he storms the embassy and murders all those agents and operatives in cold blood, to also have him be this symbol of potential peace and evolution for both sides was, I thought, really compelling and really well thought out writing. The other side to these excellently written characters, though, was how most of them, especially the main characters like Carrie and Saul, Brody, Saul's wife, Max, even as the show went on, it's so funny. Max was such a great underdog character because for the first half of the show, he was this sort of sidekick, and then he became a huge integral part of the story and the plot, especially when it came to Carrie. I just didn't see that coming. And by the way, speaking of Max, just as an aside, I have to point out that even though this show is a different genre and somewhat of a different tone, the way that I felt watching it often reminded me of watching The Shield, which is one of my favorite shows of all time, partially because it is just a forward-moving train. Of all 7 seasons, it's just always going, and you're always on the edge of your seat, and I rarely felt calm and relaxed watching Homeland. Sometimes when they focus more on the character drama than the interplay between character and plot, it would slow down a little bit, but for the most part, and this is also thanks to the fact that there was no fat on the bones of the show because it was graciously not a network show, so it didn't have to have that 20 to 24, 27 episode quota where a third of it is filler. Showtime graciously gave them, between 11 and 13 episode seasons. So nothing felt wasted, nothing felt superfluous. That's a fun word to say. So that kind of stuff definitely reminded me of the experience of watching The Shield. But so did, and I can't look it up right now, but the balding actor from The Shield, who was the interim chief of the barn at one point. Can't remember the character's name either right now. But it was great seeing him in something again too. Though I love that as he kind of faded in to the background, Max was always there and always a great fun character to have around. But anyway, speaking of all these great characters, another thing that made them so great and compelling, and I think that really elevated the show above just sort of a typical, spy drama thriller. Not that I've seen a bunch, so I don't know, typical is the right word, but just in terms of the quality of the writing and the characterization, these characters often really well embodied the themes of the show. And that seems like a no-brainer, probably, but I've really been finding that harder and harder to come by these days with more modern Hollywood output, where the themes are just laid out like a red carpet and they just bludgeon the audience with what they're trying to say. The characters will just explain themes to each other. It's the whole they're telling instead of showing thing, which should be the other way around. Even when Saul and Carrie would get into some heated philosophical debate about the right or wrong thing to do or something like that, I never felt like they were just preaching to the audience, like the characters were just a stand-in for the writers to tell the audience what they wanted them to get out of the story. These characters felt like real people, and so as they made choices and then dealt with the consequence of those choices, the story would unfold and we get our thematic content when it really came down to the true character decisions that were made, when the characters would really get to their toughest places where there was no way out. And that would speak to, I think, what the show was really all about, which is one reason that this show might not be super rewatchable for me right now, which is similar to The Shield. I watched The Shield through a few times, and it's exhausting because it is so nihilistic in some ways. It's very cynical. Homeland wasn't as much so as some shows of its ilk, of its like more like kind of high octane, super intense drama with little spouts of action here and there, but where it really does embody the thriller part of the thriller genre because you're on your edge of the seat the whole time. But I think like looking back through the show and the main characters, kind of decisions that they would make based on who their characters were and how they played off each other and how the story would play out because of that, my sense was that this show was very much about nationalism, told of course, mostly through the lens of American intelligence operatives, but we got a lot of insight into other fictionalized versions of countries too. So like the real world authenticity is open for debate, but just in terms of the real world reflection that this show was, it did seem to me like a meditation on what it means to be loyal to an idea, but constantly having that idea or that belief, that dogma, that idealist mindset being challenged and questioned. And every season seemed to kind of play out like that, where at first we would think that like Brody is a terrorist, and even though he was going to do a terrorist act, it was always in question of, was he righteous or not? Were his motivations valid, at least to a certain perspective? Was it just evil? And I think the show was pretty clear on, especially because our main character fell in love with him and had a child with him, that he wasn't evil, but he did have destructive intentions towards certain people for certain reasons. And, what do we make of that? And the show played out like that season after season of people either doing or wanting to do horrible things, but were they all bad, or were the people trying to stop them all good? But it was really the characters that made me question these things. It wasn't just like the consequences of their actions. Like in, Star Wars, for instance, when the Empire does something, until more recently, and if you've been listening to this show at all, you've heard me talk about Andor, which try to toy with this idea, and to varying degrees of success, I think, but traditionally, at least the way that George Lucas seemed to frame it, the Empire was bad, the rebels were good, and every time the Empire would do something, it was just, those are the bad guys being bad. But in Homeland, it was never that simple, because a lot of times the bad guys were working with the good guys out of necessity. Like, for instance, when Carrie was working with her Russian operative to find Max, but she had to sacrifice her loyalty to Saul, and Saul, who, represented more of America's unwavering loyalty to his country. They really embodied these themes, and in the end, it was really interesting to see how it all wrapped up, where Carrie did defect to Russia, at least on the surface, and obviously had to give up sensitive information, put people in harm's way. To a degree, she had to betray her country and everything she worked so hard for to get into a position where she could not only make up for having to out Saul's lifetime operative that he had in the Russian government, but also continue that work. And that came at a severe cost. And I said earlier that the show very rarely returned to any kind of status quo. That's why I thought this was really interesting writing, how it felt like everything really did kind of come full circle in a way, where we were back to where we started, where Carrie and Saul were working together. It's just that Carrie was doing it in a different context. So it actually felt like as the show changed and evolved, and the characters did, they were really leading back to where they started and back to where it all started. And so when it comes to the themes and that, with the show wrapping up, it was hard not to see it as kind of bleak, maybe, because what themes were these characters really embodying? What was the message after all was said and done? What it spoke to me was that it's really difficult and maybe impossible to break out of the conditioning that you are given from early on. When you're indoctrinated into a dogmatic belief, whatever it is, in this case, nationalism and loyalty to your country, even when Carrie was at her most disconnected from the CIA and American intelligence and was really working to make amends for all the harm that she felt that she did while she was in the CIA, she was still trying to make America a better place from where she sat at that time with that perspective. And she was again at the end, even though her country disavowed her and she was seen as a Russian operative back home. And yet, through all that, she gave up her daughter, she lost the love of her life and her best friend, Peter. After everything she did, including being in prison for upwards of a year in a Russian prison and being mentally abused and tortured, if not physically. Again, they never really got super detailed about what happened during that time. Even after all that, and then she succeeded with exonerating President Keen's name when it came to the whole Russian tampering angle of things that she was being accused of. Carrie was essentially forgotten and disregarded by her country until Saul, the one person that stuck his neck out for her, came forward to get her back and try to rehabilitate her. And through all of that, in the end, it seemed that her loyalty to her country never wavered, which is exemplified by the fact that she was still giving Russian secrets to Saul. And it reminded me too of the age-old theme of, is the many more important than the few or the one, like Spock says in Wrath of Khan, where all the things that people sacrificed, like Saul's marriage, or again, Carrie's relationship with her own daughter, to them it seems like, because of the way things played out, it seems to me that thematically they were suggesting that the many, the group, the bigger picture is more important than the needs or the wants of the few or the one. Essentially, in a way, they were reinforcing to me that individuals are expendable as long as they fulfill their purpose. Just like Max did, just like Peter did, just like Carrie and Saul did. So I don't think I'll be revisiting the show anytime soon because it's some heavy stuff, and though I was very entertained by it, it wasn't light popcorn entertainment, at least not to me. The only real critique or gripe I had with the show, and it never fully took me out of the show or stopped me from loving it and ravenously wanting to keep watching it and binging it. I did have moments of a little break in verisimilitude, which I'm only saying that word because it's just fun to say. One of those words you learn in film school that just means the interior logic is consistent in a story. And because the show was so grounded and gritty and realistic in so many ways, a lot of which is because it was so timely and it was playing with things that were happening during or around the time post 9/11, Iraq War, Afghanistan, and then all the ways that America's involvement in the Middle East has played out in the past, decades, but especially while this show was airing, was right in the middle of a lot of the stuff going on and the more immediate consequences still playing out of a post 9/11 situation. And even though there were bits and spurts of action here and there, it never really felt like that's what the show was all about, or it needed to rely on action to keep it interesting or gripping or thrilling, because some of the most tense and thrilling moments were like somebody just sitting in an interrogation room staring at a camera, or how many times did they flip the show just when you think things are going along in a certain direction? Like, for instance, in the season, I think it was 5 or 6, somewhere in there, where we had a vlogger character in New York that I thought was going to be like this long-term seasonal arc character that played into the plot as we went. And then they just take him out in a van explosion, and it's like, whoa, everything's changed. And they would do that every season. Something would happen where you thought things were going a certain direction, and then bam, they would just flip it. And it was so clever and such good writing and such great misdirection a lot of times, where they would lead you down one path, but you were always going this other direction. And when you look back, you're like, oh, well, that was clever. You really got one by me there, show. But even with those kind of moments, the show always, to me, felt like they were going for a very realistic, grounded tone. And yet, every once in a while, Carrie would be involved in an explosion. And I get it, it comes with the territory, it makes a lot of sense. But after the 5th or 6th time that she was peripheral to an explosion and shot backwards and her ears were ringing and nose bloody, but she would still get up and be okay, felt a little bit like a Fast and Furious or Marvel movie or something to that point. Just momentarily. It just stretched believability a little bit, and it was only because everything else was so believable. But again, I was willing to go with it, except for one other moment that really did feel more like a Jason Bourne or Mission Impossible kind of spy bordering on more just action movie thing. And it was only because they never did anything like this at any other point in the show, but I think it was towards the end of, might have even been the season finale of season 7, when Carrie's scaling the side of a building. It definitely fit in the story. It made sense for why she had to do that, but it didn't, to me, like fit her character. Yes, she was daring and brazen, and she would put herself in harm's way, and she would do dangerous things to get the job done, but the scaling the side of a building kind of thing just felt like a little bit of a tonal break. Oh, there was also, like, when Carrie was in the subway station in Berlin, that felt a little Mission Impossible-y too, when she's like, she has to jump out of the way as the train's going by. It was, it was a little much, but it was okay. Still exciting. But, those are extremely minor gripes, because they didn't dwell on them. They just did the thing and they moved on. This show, I thought, was impeccable, almost flawless, so well planned out, so well thought out. I know it didn't have a lot of hot takes or even nitty-gritty stuff to get into. I mean, I could talk all day about this season and these characters and how awesome this was, but again, I think just talking about how much I liked it is kind of useless and redundant beyond. It was really good, and if you haven't seen it, go watch it for yourself if you like spy, thriller, character drama kind of stuff. I just wanted to do a short podcast about it because it was so good, and it's been so long since I've seen a show, especially in its entirety, that was consistently great throughout, didn't drop off, didn't have any filler, didn't have to get me back on board. I can't really think of a show that I could say that about except for The Shield that I've seen in adulthood. So if you go to breathingunderwater.us, you can find all of my socials, including the show notes for my podcast, and all of those places are a great way to interact with me. Let me know what you thought about Homeland, or if you haven't seen it, hopefully you're inspired to see it, and any other shows that are in the same vein that might be good for me to check out now that I've experienced Homeland. I've heard The Americans is really good. I've heard that The Man in the High Castle is good. Always open to recommendations. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I will see you on the next one.